Dr. Lewis is a 2000 graduate of Morehouse College and is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and the Black Studies program at the City College of New York, CUNY. As a scholar, his research concentrates on educational inequality in American public schools, and his most recent research concentrates on the experiences of low-income and racial minorities' attempts at accessing school-related resources. I'm going to just leave it abbreviated there because I know that he's going to present some great stuff to us. So, Dr. Lewis, if you join us, thank you. Let's see if I can get this down.
All right, y'all live still? So I want to thank Dr. Clayton, Dr. Wall Rice, and a number of folks for bringing me out here. I feel like this is a homecoming of sorts for me. I am from Connecticut. Yes, there are black people there. I then came to Morehouse. My mother was the one who raised me, but I often say that Morehouse made me who I am. So it's my pleasure to actually engage you all tonight. Let's see if I can do that. Can we get the magic flowing here? I want to first give thanks to my ancestors who paved a path for me here, because if I don't thank them, then I won't have the path tomorrow. The title of my talk today, which let's see if a Ph.D. can figure out how to use PowerPoint. The title of my talk today is Shadowboxing the Self, Confronting Black Male Privilege. And most times when people hear the terms black male and privilege in the same sentence, they think I've lost my mind. Many folks often tell me that it's an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp, like Tyler Perry in Positive Black Film, or like the New Orleans Saints winning a Super Bowl. But we are here to demonstrate change is possible, and change indeed happens all the time. So it is my purpose here today to get you to understand that things change and to get us to proactively think about the concept of black male privilege. The reality is that Morehouse is the premier location for the academic and social development of African American men, but it is also a triaging ground for black men. Let's assume that Morehouse, like all institutions, operates with the rule of thirds. A third of the folks who come into Morehouse will enter into school, but soon return to the neighborhoods that they came from. These neighborhoods are filled with perils such as violence, lack of quality jobs, lack of quality housing, and they'll have to grapple with the question of incarceration that ensnares so many of our brothers today. These are the brothers that Hakeem Adabuti years ago said the mainstream fixated on and labeled them as single, obsolete, and dangerous. The next, the middling third, as I call them, will engage college. They'll have moderate academic success, and most of y'all know what that means when you saw your first semester and first year GPA, and you're trying to keep on getting it back up. And unfortunately, these brothers will struggle to stay afloat because of the financial cost of college. Many of them will end up crossing the stage at Morehouse, but many more will not end up crossing the stage. They'll start exiting on their own terms, but also without a degree on hand. Alternatively, there are those who enter Morehouse, who grab responsibility for their lives, feel ready to tackle nearly any task thrown at them, and these are the men of Morehouse myth. Are you familiar with them? These are the kings, right? These are the maids. These are the people that we often look up to. They're the ones that the adage is modeled after. You can always tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much. While many folks look at this group as a success story of black men and the success story of Morehouse, I refer to these men as single, successful, and dangerous. Higher education is a unique social space where the latter two-thirds that I've described will be shaped and fashioned in their worldview and orientation towards social change. Morehouse was a space where I began to transcend a narrative of black men of failing, right? And I sprung into a narrative of success. But in this leap, I also entered squarely into black male privilege. Now, it was on this very campus I began to understand black male privilege. My freshman year, a student organization called Black Men for the Eradication of Sexism was convening their first, and to my knowledge, only conference on the topic of eradicating sexism. I marked my calendar. I was prepared to attend the morning sessions of the conference on Saturday, And like many of you on Friday night, I said, well, let me chill with my folks from the dorm. Let me go out. And I know many of you are not familiar, but Atlanta is known for many things like its high-quality educational institutions in the AUC, but it is also known as the strip club capital. As a young emergent sociologist, I decided to empirically test this. And I and my brothers went out into Atlanta and made stops at several of these institutions, rigorously studying, as Dr. Peterson has already explained to us, the form of the female body in juxtaposition. And what happened is that I got back to the dorm at about, say 4 in the morning, right? And the issue became, when it was time for me to wake up for those sessions on black men eradicating sexism, I was rolling over in bed, and I felt really bad about that. And for many of you, this is enough to illustrate the concept of black male privilege, because I could have been fighting sexism, but instead I was supporting it in my actions. It was actually the responses of my friends and colleagues that caught me off guard. When I repeated sheepishly that, I didn't make it to the conference because, I hit a couple places last night and da-da-da, the reaction of my brothers was often echoed, come on, dog. I mean, we, like black men, have a lot more important things to deal with. Rather than confront the ways my actions literally posed a double hazard, right, for work against sexism, my friends and colleagues saw my actions of going to the conference as wasteful. They viewed it as such because they too saw the condition of black men. Now, mind you, this is before today. We know today 50% of black boys who begin high school in the inner city won't finish with their classmates. But this is before, when things are starting to crystallize and harden in the crisis of the black man. This is on the eve of the Million Man March, and we were there and ready to start our work. And many of the folks looked at what I was doing at Morehouse as the beginning of the process of impacting the crisis narrative of black men. They knew that it was the beginning of something significant, a time for action. We just did not see how attending a conference about stopping the oppression of women and fighting the restrictions of what it meant to be a black man was part of the new blueprint for self and community transformation. It was a logical topic, but a topic we could put on the back burner. I retell this memory to orient you to my status as the oppressed and the oppressor. This is what makes it difficult for us to see what black male privilege is. This talk is inspired by two scholars primarily, Peggy McIntosh and Jewel Woods. McIntosh, who became famous for her unpacking the knapsack of white privilege, began to make the concept of whiteness accessible to non-academic audiences. Many of you here are familiar with whiteness. It's a system of undeserved privileges that European American brothers and sisters receive that we don't. In this article, what she did was created a list, a checklist of white privilege. And this included small things like when you go to the store and you buy flesh-colored Band-Aids, it looks like your flesh or could resemble it, right? And it contained larger items like, if a traffic cop pulls you over, are you sure it wasn't because of your race? Is your safety threatened? The white privileges list has become very popular in universities, organizing, and particularly among black scholars. We love to pull it out and demonstrate to our colleagues and folks that white folks have advantages that they don't even think about in the everyday. Right? It demonstrated the ways in which privilege was embedded and social advantages were distributed globally and locally to whites that many blacks didn't enjoy. Now, Peggy McIntosh's white privileges list was actually based on her gender studies of male privilege. Ironically, in 2008, Jewel Woods published a black male privilege list to parallel and extend the work of McIntosh into the domain of black men. Woods presented political items such as, I don't have to choose my race over my sex in political matters, as well as touched on more minute cultural features with items like, I come from a tradition of humor that is based largely on insulting and disrespecting women, especially mothers. As some of you may imagine, this list was not as well received or positively engaged as the list that was presented by Peggy McIntosh. Suddenly, the big questions emerged. What privileges do black men really have anyway? If we have privileges, what can you point to that shows we're privileged? And lastly, why discuss black male privilege when black men are in such dire straits? These three questions guide my talk today as I attempt to provide a greater theoretical context for black male privilege and challenge Morehouse, my beloved alma mater, to research and teach her sons about the practical implications of black male privilege and the importance of awareness. I am arguing if we as black men do not begin to seriously interrogate the complicated ways that we are positioned as the oppressed and oppressors, the same cycles of community failure will repeat and potentially get worse. While there is no agreed upon definition for black male privilege, I often utilize the following working definition. Black male privilege is a system of built-in and often overlooked systematic advantages that center the experience and concerns of black men while minimizing the power that black males hold. I'll say it again. A system of built-in and often overlooked systematic advantages that center the experience and concerns of black men while minimizing the power that black males hold. This working definition, I believe, is important for a couple of reasons. First, we must think of the invisible sets of privilege as accumulating and impacting our lives. Second, the black male privilege makes experiences and issues of black men central and often paramount in our discussions of community change. When we think about what's happening with black communities, people often first point to black men's issues and say, let's start there. Third, in emphasizing the crisis of black men, it continues to disempower black men and block what I would consider healthy engagement of the social problems we face, which range from things like domestic violence to who attends a parent-teacher conference. All are intimately tied to black male privilege. At this point, I think it's important to note two things as well. First, black male privilege is not exclusively for heterosexually identified black men, though the most acute examples of taking advantage and manifest of black male privilege exist in that population. It is wholly possible for a brother to identify as same-gender loving or a range of other sex or gender constellations and still benefit from and utilize black male privilege to affect his social opportunities. With that being said, black male privilege is often embedded in a narrow definition of masculinity. Put simply, masculinity is how we define what being a man is. This means that as we define a man, we are also defining the privileges that come along with that membership. Masculinity studies has shown us already that not all men benefit from privilege the same, but all men benefit from privilege in areas of safety, in areas of health, in areas of community. The sociologist Harold Bloomer wrote a very important piece on racial prejudice. This was about prejudice as a sense of group position. Bloomer argued that racial prejudice was often held to maintain the position or the status of one group over another. In his studies, he was concerned about the ways in which whites would often develop, maintain, and keep prejudice in a place for blacks, even when there was conflicting evidence to blacks being inferior. And while originally prejudice was thought to be almost irrational and simply emotional, he said, no, many whites maintain prejudice because it allows them to keep an upper hand, right? To be a step above. Originally, prejudice was thought to be about xenophobia, but instead, Bloomer orients us to the idea that prejudice or disliking of someone else has rewards for the oppressor. Indeed, the prejudicial roots of black male privilege, I would argue, are about status maintenance, and less so about what we would classically call misogyny. And I mean it in the most classical sense, misogyny meaning woman-hating. I'm arguing that the engine that allows black male privilege to maintain among college-educated black men in particular is more related to seeing oneself in a leadership role and being constantly under attack. In my teaching, traveling, and field observation, the idea of leadership has been central. So I find it not ironic that Morehouse now has a world-class leadership center, an opportunity for you to minor in leadership and engage this. But the bigger question becomes, what is a leader and how do we as black men engage it? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statement, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. You heard that before? And that's by our beloved brother, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, the interesting thing is that this statement is often operationalized in meaning that everyone can serve, but men can serve as a spokespeople, as the upfront folks, right? As Patricia Hill Collins teaches us, women are often construed as the center people, as a working body, but they're not the ones in front of the camera. I think it's amazing that King made this statement, and even in this zone, that we often identify black manhood and black leadership as being up front. Because it was Septima Clark who wrote to Dr. King, who was working with the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and Septima wrote and said, Dr. King, I think you should let black women lead some of the marches, lead some of the demonstrations. And Dr. King, who I love dearly, simply responded by reading her letter aloud at a SELC meeting and laughing at her request. Even those who are successful and who we deify can suffer from the Achilles of black male privilege. Yes. On college campuses, you will continue to see an increasing importance and use of ways in which black male privilege matters, particularly at predominantly white schools. The black males who are successful are now the leaders of campus. They're the ones running organizations, community service projects, and they're serving as the new kings on campus. This form of leadership, while honorable to many, makes leadership a Herculean task, and a task that can quickly compromise one's academic and social development as a black man. It is a commitment to community that guides many black men to become greatly engaged in organizations in the community and the college as well. The increasing leadership on black male campuses has spawned what I call black Hercules. Black Hercules are those black male students who look around at the community and say something has to change. So they grab the reins by themselves and they start to head up initiatives, organizations. But oftentimes you find them grabbing so many things together that they're the only one leading and someone may not be behind them. At one predominantly white institution, I interviewed a student leader and I asked him why he led so many organizations. He offhandedly remarked, so they're not led by she-boards. She-board was a term that he and his colleagues were using, combining she and E, or executive boards. So this was shorthand to refer to organizations that were headed by women or female-dominated. When I asked him to begin to go into more depth about what a she-board was and what was the issue with she-boards, he not surprisingly suggested that women were unable to get along, they didn't know how to speak up to administration, and that he saw his role as a black male was to make sure to be in a position of power to keep organizations going. This young brother's perspective on leadership is not isolated. I encourage you to talk to brothers and sisters throughout the nation that you may know, here and at other schools, and figure out where the black Hercules are. We can all acknowledge that negotiating college as a black man is difficult. Negotiating college as a black male leader is a challenge. And I would argue that the conditions that young brothers are putting themselves under with Herculean leadership is a recipe for failure. Sadly, the effect of failure can range from declining academic performance to declining mental health status. I've seen both of these things occur. As colleges and universities begin to question, how do we successfully matriculate black men? We must also interrogate how black male privilege serves to disempower us and stop our successful matriculation. Now, many folks will ask, so recently I had a spirited debate. Some of y'all may like to call them arguments, but I call it a spirited debate. And a brother said to me, all right. So if we have black male privilege, where is it, right? What can you show me that it's gotten us? He started to spew statistics. We're in jail. We're dropping out of school. We're doing all these things, none of which I deny, right? This is a fair question, but the question of what has it gotten us relies on a faulty assumption. It's an assumption of a dichotomy. There are winners and there are losers. Instead, the returns to black male privilege are not easily seen in large-scale aggregate measures of the black population. Indeed, when you compare black men to white men, we lag behind. Indeed, when you look at us in comparison to many groups, we're behind. But you have to look carefully at the numbers to understand what's happening. Now, many of you read articles and you skip past the pictures and the graphs. I encourage you not to do that. Because when you start to look at the numbers, you realize that the condition of black men is bad. Indeed, with the recession, low-income black men were among the hardest hit. But when you start to dig into the numbers around employment, you actually see there is a trade-off effect. Once you reach a certain level of educational attainment, black men have a higher chance of being hired, receive greater amounts of dollars, as well as higher status positions when they have equal pedigree to other groups, including black women. Now, this runs in the face of a re-emergent narrative of black female success and black male failure. If you read newspapers, you'll remember a recent USA Today cover that talked about the decline in the economy in the ways in which black women were the only group that was being successful. What they don't talk about is the backstory of how black women have been locked out of education and employment. When you start at a lower point and you finally gain access, when crisis hits and you drop a little, you don't have as much ground to lose. We're actually not seeing black women outpace us because it's a zero-sum game, but because for so long we have kept them out of the opportunity to compete. I think that many of us believe that getting into a high-status job, getting a family, and getting accolades is the ideal. This becomes what many of our colleges are preparing our sons and brothers to do. This fulfillment of a traditional view of respectable black masculinity sometimes provides immunity from critique. This immunity can easily be seen when we start to talk about the topic of sex. Jewel Woods in Don't Blame It on Rio beautifully elevates the voices of middle-class black men, many of whom were married, right, who traveled abroad to partake in the sexual tourism industry, whether it be Brazil, whether it be Dominican Republic. And what he found was that these men justified their behavior by saying it was reward for negotiating the hazards and the obstacles that black men in America faced. It was their chance to finally engage being a man on their own terms. This, my friends, is black male privilege at its worst. I will not forget a couple years ago I traveled to the Dominican Republic with two other brothers, two friends of mine, and as I arrived there, a Haitian brother who was masking as Dominican, which is a whole nother other conversation, greeted us on the beach. And I won't forget when he said, "What up, my niggas? Yo, I got some real good pussy for you, and it won't cost you ballers a lot." I had to freeze and wonder, what were the images of black men that were sent out by things like videos? But also ask, what was the reality that men in my income bracket were doing and how were they behaving in Brazil and Dominican Republic that made them greet me as a consumer of sexual goods? While there are many things you can unpack in that situation, I think it's also important to think about the ways in which participating in things like the international sex tourism industry shreds the fabric of the African diaspora. It makes the currency of communication money, and it devalues contact in lives. The accumulation of privileged experience lends itself to the reification of power. As a sociologist, I'm also concerned about power on multiple levels: structural and institutional, group, and individual behaviors. In the case of black male privilege, it's important to look at the group level and to look at the individual level. If you'd like to simply look at the structural and the institutional, you'll get caught up in what I like to call the pissing contest of oppression. Let's look at these indicators and see who's at the bottom. Oftentimes, we will become wrapped up in explaining why black men are struggling so hard. I submit to you, proving on every indicator that black men at the bottom, being at the bottom, will get us no closer to figuring out how to get us out of that situation. We have to think dynamically about the concept of power and oppression and realize that it is is wielded in ways that affect our lives, and we wield it as well. So this is the part where I turn to my beloved Morehouse and historically black colleges as we figure out this concept of black male privilege. During my freshman year, there was an alleged rape. For all the brothers at Morehouse, I'm sure each year or every couple years you hear a question of sexual assault between the campuses of Morehouse and Spelman. And I emphasize alleged rape because that's when I learned to use alleged rape. While it's not my goal to talk about what's true and untrue, I think it's important to think about the discursive ways in which we respond to questions of interpersonal sexual violence within our community. The first thing I heard was, what if she's lying? The second thing I heard was, man, we got to stick together so we can rise up as a people. Coupled together, these statements suggest that by bringing up the issue of sexual assault, we are therefore destroying the fabric of our community. This could be no further from reality. The delicate balance that exists in our community between black women and men hinges upon questions of violence and property, and always has. Indeed, it was slave masters who asked us not to ask about violence and allowed us to perpetrate violence towards black women. Why would we recreate that cycle now? We know black bodies, both male and female, have never fully been under our control. This is a rare opportunity to begin to flesh out and understand how interpersonal relationships have meaning. This was the first time at Morehouse when black men told me to trust in the justice system, which I found quite peculiar. I come from the generation when the NWA was saying F the police. I was right over there. I was like, Ren said it with authority. But when it came to sexual assault, the facts weren't in. Things would be sorted out. It is that peculiar attachment to privilege that makes you trust in a system that has done you wrong for so many years. I submit that we as a community have much more important work to do on this topic. And I would like to salute the sister Laura Rahman, who has done an excellent documentary on interpersonal sexual violence in the AUC called Broken Social Contracts. Now, the last thing that I think is important about sexual violence is at Morehouse, it was the first time I saw us be able to actively flip the question of black women as being the victims, rather survivors of sexual assault, and made black men the victims. What about the assault on the images of black men? We can't get ahead if you keep on saying we're raping. We'll handle this. In reality, black male privilege always tells you, recenter your experience to the exclusion of others. This is a dangerous practice. One of the final ways I'll talk about black male privilege is the way that historically black colleges are letting it emerge and dominate their definitions of masculinity. Work I've done with my colleague Maria Johnson at the University of Michigan examines the ways that HBCUs are attempting to produce a particular form of black middle-class masculinity. At a number of HBCUs, Morehouse, Hampton, Lincoln, you name it, we've had an evolution of attempts to regulate hairstyles, style of dress, even body type. If you're unaware, Lincoln recently said we have a policy, if your BMI is over this point, your body mass index, you can't graduate. Right? At best, these strategies are a multi-pronged approach to addressing the holistic needs of the black community, and black men in particular. At worst, they represent short-sighted attempts to control the body without examining the content of black men. Hampton and Morehouse both now feature a dress code that attempts to obliterate the image of the thug, and I use that in quotes. I say this because they concentrate on hairstyles such as braids and dreadlocks, and sartorial styles and choices such as sagging pants. While these policies are seen as university policies, we have to look at them in a larger context. I hope many of you know that Morehouse isn't the only one concerned with sagging pants, because if you're in Flint, Michigan and you sag pants, it's illegal. It's indecent. You'll be fined. How do we as institutions reify the same rules that fine and imprison black men outside of the university setting? Along these lines, I argue that dress codes are often used to attempt a narrow notion of what a respectable black man is. while I have no problem with being tailored, right, I think it often reflects a class, race, and gender bias. Morehouse has received a considerable and I think appropriate amount of flack for the publication of its dress code. Most specifically, the forbidding of women's clothing and accessories. Many demand that this standard of a dress code is not problematic in and of itself, but I submit to you, Morehouse is masking for its inadequacies at developing black men of character. I submit to you that a man in a skirt can have a greater character than a man with his pants pulled up. In fact, I'd rather have a brother with a high GPA than high pants. We often assume that there is a correlation between the two with no empirical data. For those of you who think I've gone to class, that means what's the data say about how you dress and how you perform? Nothing. We continue to perpetuate a mythos that sagging pants come out of prison. Ask somebody, where's the evidence for that? And when they produce it, you tell them, come talk to me. These are the things in the myths that govern our behaviors now that we leave unquestioned. It was at Morehouse that I learned who you were mattered more than how you presented yourself. What is the cost of telling a young black man you cannot express yourself as you see fit? As Dr. Wall Rice will tell you, there is a psychological issue with telling somebody you can't be yourself. You're all about being yourself, right? That's right, yeah. He agrees, right? But unfortunately, when it gets uncomfortable, we say, well, yourself isn't good enough. In fact, that's the same thing the larger society says about black men. The way you wear your hair isn't good enough. The way you speak isn't good enough. How dare we, in these halls, greet black men and say it's not good enough? This doesn't mean that we can't enforce a standard, but it does mean we have to be particularly aware which standard we want. Mm-hmm. I'd rather have a brother of strong character than a brother who can dress well. Amen. There's a danger that I'm asking folks to address here. We use black male privilege to supplant purpose. Many brothers will come into this institution, become tailored, refined, and figure out how to use lofty words without addressing the way they behave. Without addressing who you are, you'll never fully know your purpose. As many of you will do, you'll run in here and usher yourselves into the business program because that's what you were told to do. That's how you make money. That's how you build community? Not exactly. Make decisions for yourself that empower you and lead you to a higher notion of what the community is. There are a couple things that I think Morehouse in particular can do to begin to address this crisis of black male privilege. First, take seriously the need for men's studies. Not classes that reify and deify black men and say, look, we're leaders, but classes that ask questions of what does it mean to be a man? Why do you assume that violence should be the way in which you get your message across? Mm-hmm. Right. These courses will begin to return the character to dear old Morehouse. I think it's important that we teach our students how to think methodologically in theoretical and empirically sophisticated ways. Don't allow folks to sit in classes and simply follow deficit models. When I was here, many of my professors were committed to saying, okay, follow the bouncing dot and black men are on the bottom. Follow the bouncing dot and black men are on the bottom. That has nothing to do with changing our community. We come from a rich tradition of engaging problems and transforming them. Lastly, there is a serious need for us to acknowledge that we as black men are oppressed but can be equally oppressors, particularly to our sisters. The unhealthy gender relations that we have continue to allow us to have disproportionate representation in jail and regarding domestic violence. If you ask criminologists what is one of the top reasons that police come into our community, it's because of domestic violence calls. If you want to stop the assault on black men in jail, equally stop the assault on black women. You can begin by addressing black male privilege. Lastly, study circles. While I was at Morehouse, I learned some in classes, but I learned a lot more in the hallways and in the dorm. If you are a brother who actually heard something that I said that made sense, get together. we need to elevate our voices so the administration, so other students hear. Because as the African proverb says, a closed mouth does not get fed. I want to say thank you. If you have questions or comments, email me, professorlewis.com. Special shout out to Maria Johnson, Saida Grundy, Mark Lamont Hill, and Joel Woods. Thank you.